Welcome to the Sleep Haunt. Tonight, the dark opens wider, carrying 8 of the most disturbing, scary stories, whispers that linger, shadows that follow, and moments that feel too close to forget. These are not quick frights, but echoes that stay long after the night has passed. Stay with me until the last echo, and before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Story number 1. The night attendant at the old seaside library preferred the hours when the town was asleep. Evan liked the way the building sounded then, its old bones settling, its heaters sighing, its glass quietly counting the wind. The Atlantic lived just down the hill, and on fog-heavy nights, the lighthouse blinked a pale rhythm across the reading room ceiling. He had a simple job: collect returns from the slot, empty the book cart, log the titles, and check that the rare maps remained under their thick sheets of acrylic. He moved through the stacks at a calm pace, shoulders relaxed by the familiar smell of paper and lamplight. On this particular night, the air felt cold enough to taste, and the building's long corridors held it like a secret. At 2:12, the return slot made a sound that didn't belong to it. The usual sound was a believable clatter, a dull bump of book against metal. This sound came like a measured tap, a coin on porcelain. It was small enough to ignore, easy enough to call a stray fragment of dream, but the quiet gave it importance. Evan left the clipboard on the circulation desk and approached the slot in the vestibule. The brass flap looked the same as ever, flecked with tiny scratches. He pulled open the basket that waited beneath it and found a single, plain, cloth-bound book resting on the wire. No title on the spine, no author. The cloth was the color of dust in a sunbeam. It was dry, warm even, as if it had never known the fog outside. He turned it in his hands and noticed the circulation pocket glued inside the back cover. The card within, or what looked like a card, had lines for dates and faded ink that suggested time more than it declared it. The stamp was familiar, the library's own, but an older version. The crest a little different, the address written with a street name that had changed decades ago. He placed the book on the desk and looked for a catalog record. There was none. He checked the unprocessed piles, the special collections list, the database. Nothing. The book simply existed, accompanied by a card that belonged and did not belong. He slid the card out. On the back, in neat, precise handwriting, was a sentence that made the skin at the base of his neck notice itself. At 2:17, the stairs will miscount. He set the card down and laughed quietly under his breath. Not out of humor, but out of habit. People laughed when something formed and formless at once stepped forward. He watched the clock on the far wall, the second hand ticking without apology. He could hear the stairs all the way from the desk, the old wooden risers that led to the mezzanine. They were honest steps, unashamed of creaks. At 2:16 and 45 seconds, he glanced in that direction. Nothing. At 2:17 exactly, a sound came from there that he knew by heart, only shifted. A footfall where no foot pressed, the whisper of weight on the 4th step when the first had not yet been taken. The stairs counted wrong, adding a step that didn't exist, and then, as if embarrassed, fell quiet. Evan held the card a moment longer. The writing looked so certain. He turned the book toward him and opened to the first page. No title. A table of contents without names, only numbers. He closed it, and without knowing why, slid the book into the book drop basket again, then pulled it back out. It felt as if the slot were a mouth, and he had taken something back from it in mid-sentence. The return slot tapped again at 2:23, as if someone on the other side were politely reminding him to pay attention. He opened the basket and found a thin pamphlet he had never seen before. The cover showed a pencil drawing of the library's east face from a vantage point the building did not offer. Inside, folded carefully, was a blueprint again, familiar and not. The plan matched the layout except for one hallway that did not exist. Along that hallway, small numbers had been marked in ink, and down one side in the same neat hand as before, a note. The clock in the genealogy room will stop at 2:31. When it does, do not answer the phone. He carried the pamphlet to the genealogy room, shoes barely whispering on the carpet. He looked up at the old clock on the wall, a round face with hands like narrow leaves. It ticked bravely toward the minute in question. The phone on the desk remained still. He waited, and as his breathing settled into the waiting, the clock's second hand paused between 2 markers. The room's small hums seemed to tilt toward the absence. The phone began to ring. It was a pleasant sound, modest, nothing like alarm bells, yet it felt larger than it should. The ring traveled the length of the wood grain, up the legs of the desks, into the floor. He looked at the blueprint, at the inked warning. He had never been the kind to test advice that arrived in peculiar ways. He let the phone ring and kept his hands in his pockets. It rang 4 times and stopped. The clock, without apology, resumed. He breathed out, not realizing he had held anything inside. Something had pressed at his ribs, a suggestion of loss. Standing just outside the door, unable to enter. The old building seemed to settle a little deeper into itself, as if satisfied. He followed the blueprint's impossible hallway with his finger. It ran behind the atlas case, down a narrow seam between 2 stacks, and ended at what was labeled simply, quiet room. There was no quiet room in the library, except for the rooms that always tried to be. He stood at the atlas case and looked for a seam. The case was heavy oak, varnished until it held the light. He tugged gently on the side panel and felt it give, not with the stubbornness of a stuck piece of furniture, but with the compliance of something designed to move when asked in the right way. The panel slid, the casters hummed, and a thin corridor revealed itself where there had been none. Evan stepped into it, and held his breath without realizing it again. The walls were the same aged wood as the rest of the building, the floor the same scuffed planks, but the air was cooler, and a soft draft made a whispery sound at ankle height. He moved forward. The corridor took a turn that felt like memory rather than architecture. The light was even unremarkable and impossible. No bulbs, no sconces, yet a steadiness as if the space itself provided what was needed. He reached a small landing, and there the corridor ended at a door painted the exact quiet green of the mezzanine chairs. No handle, only a small brass drop slot set at waist height, though lower than the returns in the vestibule. He looked down at his hands and realized he had brought the cloth-bound book and the blueprint without making a choice to do so. He slid the blueprint into his back pocket and knocked on the door, gently, in the way people knock when they are not certain which rules apply. No answer. The return slot gleamed. He held the book closer and saw at last a title embossed so shallowly it had hidden in the cloth. Index of Near Things. He smiled, not because it was funny, but because relief comes in odd forms. The thing had a name. He tipped the book and placed it against the slot in the door. The slot accepted the weight the way a palm accepts another palm. The book slid through, and for a moment his fingertips felt the smallest tug from the other side. He listened, expecting a thump. There was none. The lights flickered once, not from stress, but the way a room nods lightly when someone says something it understands. He heard, far away, the old heater cough, and then steady itself. He returned through the corridor, pushed the atlas case back into place, and checked the desk clock. 2:41. The building's minutes had thickened. The return slot in the vestibule blinked again at 2:51. He found an envelope this time, creamy and unsealed, his name handwritten on the front with a careful hand that did not rush. Inside lay a library card, the older style, stiff and heavy to the touch, with his name printed in a typewriter's patient font, Evan Palmer. He held the card beside his name tag. His name tag read Evan Palmer. The difference was a single letter stepping where it wasn't expected. Beneath the printed name was a due date. Tonight. He noticed his breath fog the envelope even in the closed room. He ran his thumbs along the edges of the card and felt nothing to argue with. The back of the card had a single line. The revolving rack will show winter. When it does, step through. His gaze moved to the souvenir rack near the window. The postcards had always been gently out of place in a library, the board had insisted, claiming tourists loved the vintage images of their town's lighthouse in storms and in lazy summer Sunday. The rack turned lazily on a dowel, pushed by air currents too faint for a person to feel. Tonight, the cards all displayed autumn leaves along the cliff walk, children in scarves, a harvest festival on the green. He watched, and the rack turned, one card at a time. Summer to autumn, autumn to spring. The seasons shaking hands briefly in cardboard. He set the envelope down and walked the stacks to keep from staring at the rack and forcing it with attention. He checked the rare maps again, the glass reflecting the quiet blink of the lighthouse. He traced the spines of the local histories, the names steady and proud. He touched the light switches in each room the way a ranger touches gate latches, not to disturb, only to confirm presence. At 3:06, The rack made a soft click. The image facing outward showed a snow-covered path down to the very building he stood in. The sky in the picture was white and heavy, the lighthouse a pale rule. The rack held still, as if listening. He stood, then walked with the care of someone who enters a room where a child sleeps. The air around the atlas case was steady. The panel waited. His hand fit against the wood where it had fit before, and the panel moved without protest. The corridor opened itself again, and the cool was a shade deeper. Down the hall, the quiet green door stood in its place, and a thin line of darker shadow traced its edges, the way a book that has been read 100 times remembers the warmth of hands. This time, the door stood slightly ajar, the air from inside barely moving, as if something on the other side were holding its breath out of courtesy. He eased it open and found a room that was not a surprise, and yet did surprise, because it had the feeling of being waiting for him, and also of being the kind of place people hoped existed without saying so. The quiet room truly was quiet, but not empty. Chairs sat at equal distances from one another, upholstered in that same green, with small tables at their elbows and lamps, whose shades were the color of morning pages. On the central table lay a stack of library cards, each with a name he did not recognize, each stamped returned. On the far wall, a shallow tray like the ones in the vestibule returns sat below a small slot. Above it, a brass plaque read, "Returns after hours." A single slip of paper rested in the tray like a bookmark, neat and patient. He picked it up. It was a slip printed with the library's current crest. In the space for title, someone had written, "Index of Near Things." In the space for borrower, EP. The due date read tonight. The fine column was blank. He looked around and waited for the room to do something. It did nothing, and everything. The lamps hummed like moth wings. The chairs held their shapes. On a coat rack, a scarf hung as if its owner had just stepped out to stretch their back. A clock with no numbers ticked in a rhythm so benediction soft, he could feel his heart adjust to match it. He placed his fingers on the slip. The paper gave, then waited, like an old friend offering a hand for the first time. He slid the slip under the acrylic on the table, aligning it with the others. The room's temperature shifted half a breath warmer, as if a long note played on a cello had resolved into the chord it had promised all along. He looked toward the slot above the tray. He did not bring the book with him, but somehow the act of acknowledging its return had satisfied a rule the room cared about. He stood in that acknowledgement for a moment longer, and then stepped back into the corridor. As his shoe crossed the invisible threshold, the door eased itself shut with the kind of politeness found in old elevators. The corridor felt shorter on the way out, as corridors sometimes do when they have already delivered what they meant to deliver. The atlas case set itself back into place with a weighty kindness. The air in the main room felt ordinary again, ordinary in the way a story's last paragraph leaves the world unchanged and entirely altered. At 3:29, the vestibule slot rang with a normal clatter. He found several actual returns from the outside, a gardening book, a novel with a cracked spine, a slim collection of poetry with a dog-eared love poem. In among them was a single card, not in an envelope, not pretending to be anything else. It read, in that measured hand, "Thank you for not answering the phone. You will forget what you did not lose." He read the line several times until its weight found its balance. Something he might have misplaced an old birthday, a name he had not spoken in years, remained with him because he had not reached for a ringing phone. The relief was not dramatic, but it was real. He filed the card in the drawer where found notes lived. At 4:06, a draftsman's sort of chill moved through the room, straight as a ruler. The postcards on the revolving rack flicked once, and then stilled on winter again, even though no hand had touched them. He raised his eyes to the skylight. Outside, the fog wrapped its arms around the building, softening edges. He could feel dawn somewhere beyond it, the way a seashell feels the tide that has not yet arrived. The phone rang once, then stopped. The clock in the genealogy room took a long breath, and continued. He walked to the front doors and looked at the brass until he saw his face reflected in it, not to examine himself but to check the shape of a world he wanted to be sure of. Behind his reflection, he could see the desk lamp burning like a small, faithful planet. At 4:43, a final envelope slid into the returns basket without sound. Inside it was another card, this one printed rather than written. The library crest. The words, "You are shelved correctly," Please keep the quiet. See you after dusk. He turned it over and found, stamped in small letters, a phrase that felt like the library placing a calm hand on the day ahead. The building remembers. He put the card back into the envelope and slid it into his shirt pocket like a secret worth keeping. He set the chairs straight. He aligned the pencils into a tidy cup. He checked the papers people had left behind and filed the ones that held names, careful not to expose stories that had chosen to hide. At 5:02, the lighthouse blinked one more pale stripe across the ceiling and surrendered to the faintness of morning. The fog thinned, and the town yawned. He unlocked the doors for the day shift and left a short note in the log. Found an older pamphlet, reorganized stacks near Atlas case, all secure. He did not write about the corridor. He did not write about the winter postcards or the green door. He did not write about the index of near things. He chose not to name a room that had asked to be kept as a room should be kept. When the day staff arrived, they commented on small improvements, how the geography shelves looked newly sensible, how the atlases seemed easier to lift, how the lights came on without their usual flicker. One of them glanced at his name tag and tilted her head. "New badge?" she asked, friendly and curious. He looked down. Evan Palmer. For a moment, he did not recognize the letter that did not belong. Then he smiled with his mouth and let his eyes remain elsewhere. Badge printer must have been sleepy, she said, already moving to her tasks, not particularly interested in a mistake without consequence. He placed the wrong right tag against his shirt and smoothed it with a thumb. The difference felt so close to nothing that one could call it nothing. And yet it was a letter placed where a breath would pause differently if read aloud. That night, when the fog returned as if it had only been on an errand, Evan unlocked the library and stepped into the cooled air. He let the door close behind him and stood a moment in the vestibule. The return slot waited with its usual politeness. The building held itself like a person in a photograph who, having decided to be still, was astonishingly good at it. The clock on the wall counted evenly. He walked the stacks. He listened. He tested the light switches as always. He greeted the atlases under gloss and thanked the chairs for being chairs. At 2:12, the return slot made a sound that belonged to it. He reached for the basket with calm hands, curious and unafraid, and prepared to see what the building, in its precise and patient way, had decided should come back tonight. Story number 2. The city's photographic archive lived beneath the museum, down a flight of concrete steps where voices always softened without being told to, and where the glow of the safe light turned everything the warm red of a remembered sunset. Machines breathed politely. The sink hummed. Paper made its particular whisper when lifted by gloved hands. Mara preferred these hours. When the traffic overhead became a distant, steady tide, and the air felt like a page about to be turned. The shipment arrived late, long after the registrars had left. It was a small metal case, the kind with rounded corners and a handle shiny from a long-ago palm. The envelope attached to its lid said only, "A State of I. Rallis. Darkroom Materials. Box 7 of 7. No one had placed box 1 through 6 on the intake shelf, and the inventory spreadsheet had not yet been updated. The box held its quiet like a person standing at the threshold, undecided if they should knock. Mara logged it, signed, and set the case on the stainless steel table where light bounced upward in a thin, patient ribbon. She cleaned the workspace out of habit, even when it did not need cleaning. The safe light clicked on with a small sound like a throat clearing. The timer's black face regarded her calmly. She breathed in the faint, clean scent of fixer and paper and cool water. She opened the case. Inside, a neatly arranged grid of negative sleeves lay stacked like letters everyone forgot to send. No dust, no curled edges. On top of the stack lay a single index card, typed with a ribbon that had long ago faded at its edges. "Expose for the room." She smiled at the phrase, the kind of joke a photographer would love, or a note to themselves that felt like advice for life. She pinned the card to the corkboard above the sink because it felt like the sort of sentence that deserved to watch. The negatives were medium format, squares of night and day caught and carefully sleeved. She chose a sleeve at random and held it under the loop. Expecting streets, strangers, windows lit, like held breath. The frames were full of glass and rails and lines, architecture and sky. In one, a long ceiling with pipes and grids. She tilted her head. The ceiling could have been anywhere, but something about the rhythm looked familiar. She prepared the contact sheet the way she always did. moving through steps like a swimmer, gliding out toward a buoy everyone knew was there even when fog hit it. The paper slid into the developer tray and promised nothing until it promised everything, and the first imprints surfaced slow as islands. At first, it was only form edges, contrast, shapes aligning themselves. Then the shapes became the room she stood in. The table, the sink, the two stools, and the crooked tilt of the calendar she had never straightened. In the contact sheet, the calendar hung perfectly even. The stool near the air vent sat one tile to the left from where it stood in real life. On the far edge of the frame, where the rolling ladder leaned against the shelves, a faint smudge like the suggestion of a shoulder hovered, a human curve so slight the eye might have called it a shadow, if the mind had not already decided to notice. She looked up at the actual stool, her gloved hands still and dripping over the tray. It had not moved. The calendar still listed last month. She blinked and laughed softly, the sort of laugh that a person offers when a coin they did not remember placing appears under a cup. The margin of the contact sheet held something her eyes had not seen at first. A slim line of type in an old-fashioned font, barely visible. She lifted the sheet to the safe light and angled it. The letters emerged a fraction deeper than the paper around them, ink pressed so delicately that it felt like the paper had learned to speak instead of being told to. 113. Wipe the faucet. The leak will try to become a habit. She looked at the darkroom sink. A drop gathered fat at the lip of the faucet and fell into the tray like a tiny drum. Another formed obediently. She snatched a towel, quick but without panic, and dried the metal, tightened the handle gently, the way one tightens the string of a kite not to tame it but to make it work. The next drop took longer to think about itself, then did not fall at all. She stood very still. The safe light hummed. The clock above the door ticked in a soft, agreeable way. She closed her eyes and opened them again. The margin text remained, calm and useful, like a note from someone who knew her routine. She told herself that the faint letters could have been names of frames, cut off and misaligned in a way that created this moment. It comforted her to think of explanations that could be folded like paper and put away. She made another contact sheet from a different sleeve. In it, the same room again, but from a slightly higher angle, as if the camera had been affixed to a ceiling that never knew a mount. The ladder was an inch to the right. The rolling cabinets bore labels in neat handwriting that matched hers, but with a small difference. The S in Misk Stills curved like a ribbon instead of the straight stroke she had learned in grade school. In the far corner, the door to the cold storage room was closed in the photograph. In real life, it stood ajar because she had propped it with an empty box for airflow. On this margin, another line, 126. Do not leave the vault propped. It closes itself when it feels alone. She put the towel down, walked to the cold storage vault, removed the empty box, and let the heavy door settle into its latch. As if encouraged, the compressor inside gave a satisfied, low breath and settled into its usual contented hum. The elevator upstairs sighed. She heard footsteps cross the museum floor above security doing rounds, likely. Below, the lab held itself in a posture that felt attentive. She picked up a blotter and fanned the contact sheets dry, the motion practiced and easy, the paper making sounds like quiet weather. The next negative sleeve contained frames of the staircase that led down to the archive handrail, concrete. The bend where a small window looked toward a strip of sky that kept an honest blue, even at night. Only in one frame did a person appear. Not a figure, exactly, more like the idea of one. A darker piece of dark stepping where the landing corner softened. The margin line read, 134. When the bolt clinks, count to 6 before opening. The glass needs time to remember. It is glass. She almost said aloud that the building did not need her to indulge its personality, but the bolt at the top of the stairwell gave a polite clink, as if, not hearing her, it had continued with what it was built to do. She waited, counted in her head, reached 6, and opened. The stairwell air felt a degree warmer than the lab. The small window's pane held a thin sheen of condensation that broke and slid aside without streaking. A little favor, nothing more. She returned to the dark and to the light that called itself safe. She stopped telling herself that the text was an artifact of the printing process. The letters changed, the advice adjusted. The messages arrived only when she set the next sheet in the tray, as if the words preferred to develop at the same pace as the images they referred to. There was comfort in the regularity. Immerse, agitate, wait. Watch the pale grain rise as if drawn from within. Lift at the edge. Tilt. And find the message right where the mind expected it. None of the lines were warnings, exactly not the way warnings are usually shaped. They were suggestions with a calm understanding of how small things become bigger. When ignored, close the drawer gently at 147, do not roll the ladder past the tape seam at 153, loosen the enlarger's clamp by 1/4 turn at 158. Each one leaned into kindness. Each one helped the night feel held by someone else's attention. When the clock reached 2:09, she pulled another sleeve and saw frames of the museum's main hall above. The dinosaur skeleton beyond glass. The mural that made children reach up to touch painted stars. The prints were lovely. The light on bone made it look like a winter tree. The margin line did not speak to the lab this time. 2:12. On the fourth ring, pick up. The downstairs phone behaved itself most nights. A handful of people knew the number. She watched the second hand move with the steady, small bravery of a second hand. At 2:12, the ringtone rose in the room in 4 small, even steps. She let it ring once, twice, 3 times, and then lifted the receiver gently into the crook of her shoulder. "Archives?" she said. She could have sworn she heard the C, then breath, then the faintest clatter of something wooden being set on a table. A voice, friendly, calm, said, "This is night security on 2. Just checking you're down there." She had not heard the elevator open again. "I'm here," she said. "Everything good?" The guard chuckled. "A child's mitten turned up in the fossil hall, that's all." Imagine that. A mitten in summer. He paused, considered something. "Lock the inner corridor door when you go up. It sticks, and then we forget." She said she would. He thanked her and hung up. The ringing ended with that soft little click that meant 2 people who shared a hallway had just put down their phones and returned to their small circuits. She developed another sheet. The room grew a degree more itself each time the paper yielded up its image. She watched the image float in, patient at the edges, and found the margin. 2:20, the case will click. Open it slowly. There is a letter. She looked at the metal case. It had no latch, only a lid and the memory of a lid's weight. Then, as if reassured by being the subject of attention, the lid made a tiny sound, less a click than a shy adjustment. She walked over, lifted it with 2 fingers, and saw the paper she had not seen before, nested beneath the top layer of sleeves. The letter was typed in the same patient ribbon as the index card, but with more confidence, as if the words had known they would one day be read down here by someone standing as she stood. "If you are reading this, then the hours are still kind to the air under the museum. You will find frames that show what rooms know about themselves. They insist on the near. Let them. When you are asked, indulge them. They keep their side of the promise. If a picture shows you how to spare a noise from being a problem, do it. Looking is a kind of help." Mara held the letter at arm's length and felt the room nod. She slid it back into the case, above the sleeves, where a hand that liked to leave things orderly would find it. The next sleeve contained frames of the street outside the lamp, across from the loading dock, the quiet pavement, the reflection of the museum's columns in a puddle that managed to be there even on dry nights. The margin read, 2:33, waved to the person on the bench. You won't see them clearly, but they'll feel it. She did something she had not done in recent memory. She walked up the stairwell, unlocked the inner door, then the outer, and stood in the half-shadow of the museum's back landing. Across the narrow stretch of alley, a low bench waited beneath the lamplight. She could not make out anyone there. The light held itself, and the night smelled like the end of a long page. Still, she raised a hand and waved. Nothing moved for a long second. Then a glint of the lamplight caught on something, a metal ring on a keychain, and a person's hand, where she hadn't quite thought a person was, lifted in answer. A small, grateful gesture, as if a long, cold thought had just been unknotted. She smiled, though no one was close enough to see. She locked the doors on her way back in. The inner door stuck a little, and she pushed her hip into it with a small motion she remembered from the guard's call. It would be fine until morning. Downstairs, another contact sheet came up in the tray. It showed the cold storage door again, closed in the frame, open in real life. The margin said, 241. When the compressor stutters, do not go in. The button will forget its job for a minute. She stood very near the vault door and listened. The compressor hummed contentedly. Then, as if deciding to clear its throat, it paused and tried to start and paused again, a stutter that felt like a mind searching for a word on the tip of the tongue. She waited beside it with the patience you extend to friends and machines. After a minute and a half, it resumed. A single smooth breath re-entering the room. She touched the door not to open it, but to thank it for behaving. The paint felt cool and honest under her glove. The archive at night began to feel like a house that had decided not to let its old joints get to it. The more she listened, the more it offered. Not miracles, exactly, but considerations. The tiny, low hum of the enlarger, which she had always thought was an idle warmth, now felt like a cat's purr convincing a morning to arrive on time. The paper cutter waited until she had fully lined up the sheet before its blade moved with that clean whisper. The clock, though unremarkable, did not falter. Not all the messages were about avoiding small inconveniences. Some were simply gifts. 2:53. Open the blue binder. Page 6. She opened the binder of accession records and found page 6 filled with neat notes in longhand by someone whose pen had a curious way of landing the dot on an I so lightly it might lift off. Tucked between the pages was a photograph of the museum's terrarium from decades ago, ferns so proud they seemed to reach out. A tortoise regarding the camera with the benevolence of something that measures time on a different instrument than the rest of the world. On the back, in pencil, "For whoever loves the smell of wet leaves." She did. The picture made that smell appear briefly in her throat, and then it faded, leaving the air smelling again like metal and paper and the small river of the sink. She rinsed prints. She hung them on the line. Droplets formed on the bottom edges and released one by one, marking the tray with tiny circles that ringed outward and mixed without ever insisting on a pattern. The floor felt level beneath her feet, though she knew, from old blueprints, the slabs sank 1/4 inch from west to east. The mind held its own plumb line. At 3:07, another contact sheet resolved a different angle of the same room herself this time, but not a perfect mirror. In the print, she wore her pale cardigan buttoned. In life, she had left it open. In the print, her hair was gathered behind her head. In life, it fell loose over her shoulder. More startling than these niceties was the expression in the print, which could not form until she had reacted to it. She looked like a person waiting for a sound to tell a story. On the margin, 3:10. Do not hang the last 3 prints together. Space them. You will like the corridor they make. She followed the suggestion. The 3 prints she had just rinsed, 2 of the lab and 1 of the hallway upstairs, she clipped with extra intervals between them on the drying line. They swung a fraction in the ventilation's breath, aligning themselves so that the gaps between them made a small passage in which the safe light collected itself and laid across the table in a way she had not seen before. She stepped through the space between them, like a person stepping through a beam of sunlight deliberately, letting a color rest on her skin just for the experience of it. The messages did not tell her where they came from, and she did not ask. She had the sense that they were not sent across a distance so much as across a timeliness, like a note slipped beneath a door by someone who knew the hinge's habits. Sometimes the messages felt like the room speaking to itself in a language that required her as translator. When the clock moved toward 3:28, the negative in the enlarger showed the museum's lobby with its wide glass doors. Just outside, framed by reflections, someone stood so still they could have been a detail on a map. The margin said, 3:30. The person outside is not you. Do not wave this time. Turn off the radio instead. She reached out and quieted the radio she kept low at night to keep her company. The sudden silence felt gentle rather than empty. A moment later, a reflection shifted in the lobby glass upstairs, and the someone who was not her turned, saw their own reflection, and walked away, satisfied with whatever conclusion their night required. She did not know if the radio's quiet mattered, but she liked the idea of participating in a small, harmless choreography whose steps needed one person to agree to them. Later, near 4 o'clock, when the air felt the way air feels just before a new color enters it from the horizon, she found a sleeve at the bottom of the stack that held 1 frame only. She placed it in the enlarger out of respect more than curiosity, set the exposure by feel, and watched the image come alive with a slowness that felt protective. This photograph was taken at the work table where she now stood. It showed an open notebook, a pen across it, and a square of paper centered on the left page with 1 sentence written in her own handwriting. When the humidifier clicks, Crack the window. The paper will curl otherwise. She looked at the instrument in the corner that kept the room's air from tiring the materials. It clicked, that small, friendly sound that told you two machines had agreed on a shared rhythm. She walked to the narrow window near the ceiling, where the night had pressed its cool, dark forehead to the glass, and opened it the smallest amount. The air moved. The drying prints on the line held their planes. The curls they might have developed were never allowed to form. She reached for the notebook that lay on the table and found it as shown, a pen across. Page open, square of paper blank. She looked at her hand, at the print, at the hand in the print that had written in her handwriting. She lifted the pen and wrote the sentence exactly as she had seen it. After that, something in the room exhaled. Not relief exactly. Completion. The feeling of a seam stitched and cut clean. The metal case held more sleeves, but she did not hurry. The messages had shorter intentions toward dawn. They became less about the next minute and more about the next day. Put box 7 on the shelf beside box 3, even if 3 has not yet arrived. It will make the shelf behave. Ask the registrar for the key to drawer D. Inside it is an old list with a mistake you can fix. Remember to eat at 4:15. Someone before you forgets. Her smile at that last one belonged to no one but her. She sat on the rolling stool and let her shoulders find their own height. The prints hung like small windows into the act of seeing. She walked the length of the lab once more. Not to check anything, but to be checked by it, to be counted and included. On the corkboard above the sink, the index card saying "Expose for the room" had been joined by another she had not pinned. It was the same cardstock, the same age in its edges. It read, "When someone else stands where you stand, leave one sentence on the left page." She looked down and watched a droplet form and let go at the edge of a print, a round, clear coin returning to the tray. The world kept making itself in small, repeating gestures that never felt mechanical. When it came time to turn off the lights, she stood at the switch and paused. The lab's soft persuasion, the way it asked and offered, had made an hour feel like a held breath, and a held breath feel like an hour. She imagined a future person, years from now, opening a metal case, feeling very awake, reading a line that made them wave to an empty bench or close a faucet or write their own voice onto a square piece of paper. She liked the idea of being one of many who kept the quiet running clean. She shut off the safe light last. The room accepted the dark without resentment. The machines went on murmuring, because that is what they were made to do. The prints hung, drying, holding moments like they were carrying small birds in cupped hands. On her way up, she locked the inner door, and then, remembering the guard's advice, set the bolt firmly, letting it clink into certainty. In the stairwell window, a ribbon of morning had started to lay itself down, pale and agreeable. She reached the museum lobby and looked out over the street. The bench sat under a new color of light. No one occupied it. Across the road, a delivery person rolled a dolly out of a van and paused, as if listening. She raised a hand without thinking, a little goodbye wave offered to the last minutes of the dark. The delivery person smiled and waved back, friendly and unsurprised, and kept on with the day. In the archive, below, the contact sheets cooled. The margin letters dried. Later, when someone came down and filed them, they would notice the lines and call them an artist's quirk, or an artifact, or an invitation. No one would insist on an explanation. Rooms do not always require one. Sometimes they only need a person willing to look when they ask. Story number 3. The last run of Route 77 began at a place of concrete and quiet. Lena liked the depot at that hour, when the buses lined up like the backs of sleeping whales, and the city's sounds arrived filtered through distance. Inside the cab, the seat knew her shape, the dashboard lit with small patient lights. A card taped beside the radio displayed the stops in neat relief. Riversend, Daly, Hillcrest, Ash and Pine. Terminal. The route was familiar enough that the wheel felt like a clock hand, turning toward minutes she had watched often. She pulled out, the bus kneeling to clear the driveway. The air brakes giving a sigh like a long sentence finishing. The driver's mirror caught her face for a second, then returned her to the street. Empty lanes, parked cars, the glow of storefronts that believed in morning more than midnight. The stop request chime lived quiet, a polite promise in the ceiling. At Riversend, one passenger waited, a man with a folded newspaper he had likely been carrying all day. He boarded with a nod that meant thank you without using the word, tapped his card, and chose a seat by the wheel well. They exchanged no further conversation. At Daly, a nurse in clogs lifted a thermos, as if to toast something no one else could see, and took the second row. The bus moved. Lena's hands settled their small adjustments, and the city adjusted around them. Between stops, the display above the aisle gently prepared its next announcement. Hillcrest. It would say in a calm voice when they neared the crest of the hill where the houses wore porches like collars. The bus had a rhythm. The rhythm had rooms in it where attention could rest. She checked the mirrors. No one pulled the cord. No one gave trouble to anyone else. On the climb to Hillcrest, the stop request chime sounded once, small and definite. The light glowed above her. A red band of intention. Lena glanced in the mirror. No cords moved. The nurse stared at her phone with the gravity of a person watching a color dry. The man with the newspaper looked exactly where a person looks when they know not to be a bother. The light stayed on. The bus voice announced, not Hillcrest, but Village Green, a stop Route 77 had not touched in 10 years. Lena lifted the radio, thumb on its worn transmit button. Dispatch. 517. I've got an extra chime. And the system says Village Green. Static ruffled the space, then a voice arrived, calm in a way that made the air settle. Copy, 517. It might be the overlay from the update. Continue as usual. We'll watch it. Roger, she said, without being surprised, and let the bus do its business. Hillcrest arrived on schedule. A pair of porch lights blinked with a dot of kindness as she passed. No one disembarked. The chime reset itself as if nothing had happened. At Ash and Pine, the nurse stepped down, thanking Lena with a small lift of the thermos. Long night? She said. Just a night, Lena said, and meant it kindly. The man with the newspaper rode on. He held the paper folded so precisely it could have been an architectural model. The bus descended the long grade where the river hid behind brick and trees. The ceiling vents whispered. Somewhere underfoot, a small rattle offered itself, then thought better of it. 2 stops later, the display flickered its calm letters, and momentarily showed an old name, Marrow Street. The city had renamed that corner after a painter, 6 years ago. Lena had spent a winter retraining her mouth to say the new name when the bus asked. She didn't much like how Marrow felt in the mouth anyway. It made an old feeling under the tongue. The letters shifted back to the current name before the voice spoke. The bus sounded normal when it did so, unbothered by the moment it almost remembered. An orange scarf flared in the corner of her eye as they passed the shuttered cafe on Ellery. A woman stood there, wrapped in that band of color, looking down the road the way people look when they've chosen the direction and are waiting for their decision to arrive. Lena checked her mirror. 2 more blocks, and there was the same scarf at another stop. The same posture of waiting. The bus could outrun a person on foot without trying. The scarf remained improbable and also exactly itself an object redrawing a map by simply being bright. At Willow and 3rd, the bus knelt obediently, even though no one had pressed the button. The doors opened and closed themselves, with the soft intention of a hand arranging a tablecloth. The night air came in, touched the soles of shoes, and slipped away. The man with the newspaper looked up briefly, then down again, as if it were considered, and then filed under nothing to worry about. Dispatch? Lena said, for company as much as for report. 517 again. Willow and 3rd just kneeled without a request. No contact on the reader. Copy kneel with no request, the voice said. Road sensors can do that. You're clear. Proceed. If there was anything wandering beyond the glass, it behaved better than most. It made no demands. The bus asked simple things of a person: to stop in the painted box, to let the old man find his change, to count the minutes until the terminal. Lena gave these things. The bus returned them with the kind of gratitude that does not announce itself. On South Line, 2 teenagers ran for the rear door, laughing without mockery, racing the kind of race all cities understand. She opened and the laughter pulled through like a ribbon. They thanked her without pausing their sentence and carried their jealousy of morning out into a parking lot where it would cool and crumble by breakfast. The next oddness came quietly. The overhead voice did not misname a stop or announce one twice. Instead, at a red light near where Marrow wasn't anymore, it said, "Next stop," and hung there, as if the name were a little further away than usual. The silence that followed was not empty. It had the feeling of a hand held out for a small object. The bus rolled forward when the light surrendered, and the voice completed itself, as if embarrassed. A man on the sidewalk adjusted his hat, a simple human correction that reassured Lena more than any radio. At the curve before the bridge, the litter sensor on the side door thought someone stood very close. The display blinked in its silent code. A green pedestrian light on the far corner changed at a strange hour for an empty street. Lena eased the bus to the painted box and opened her doors because the machine wanted her to. A pressure changed, a weight that wasn't a weight left, and the bus stood a fraction taller, the way a porch feels when the person on it steps down. No one had sat in the front seats. The newspaper man still held his fold. He disembarked at West Meadow without saying anything at all, and his absence made a shape. Lena found herself adjusting the rear view to see who else made that shape differ. The bus, lighter, took the next incline with a cheer. The engine hummed in a register that made the windshield reflect the city like it was writing in cursive across the glass. In the quiet between districts, the orange scarf appeared one more time, an echo of color at the end of a block marked with paper signs for yard sales that had long since packed up. Lena did not wave. The habit of not making that kind of agreement felt important. She watched in the mirror, as the scarf, having been seen, gave no reaction at all. Past Midnight Center, a fog moved in from the river without being visible. A fog only in how it changed sound. The stop request chime stayed obedient. The route printed on the card looked like a list and not a riddle. Yet the bus began to time itself around a corner that no longer existed. The pattern of the lights and intersections guided her body toward a turn the city had erased. She felt it in her shoulder first, a small desire to lean the wheel. It made no sense. The new traffic design had spared the buses a cumbersome dip to the right, but the old path pulled anyway. On a flat part of town where the buildings were low enough to offer the sky as a gift, Lena decided to indulge the map that lived in her muscles. She signaled, turned at the corner where Marrow used to go by that old name, and made one discreet loop around the block that had been removed from Route 77's duties. No one on the bus objected. The night seemed to approve of the courtesy. At the far side, by a patch of grass cut into a triangle, a signpost still stood in front of nothing now. The metal bones of the frame once held route schedules. The frame had no paper left in it. Its shadow lay where shadows lay. She eased the bus to a stop with the doors aligned with that old ghost of a sign. The head sign inside the bus, without asking her, scrolled to Marrow. It felt like a bus being honest with itself for a moment. She opened the doors. The ramp did not deploy. The kneel stayed level. Something that had wanted to comply with a schedule complied, and then was finished with the wanting. She did not hear words. She did not feel a breath on her wrist. She only felt the bus release a small tension, the way a sentence releases when a clause no longer needs to be held apart by commas. She closed the doors and merged back toward the trajectory she was paid to keep. The head sign returned to the present. The stop request chime, which had kept its peace during that courtesy, resumed its normal, occasional life. The overhead voice announced ash and pine, smooth and certain. The river sounded like a river again. She drove to terminal and only 2 more people boarded, both carried backpacks and eyes that measured distances against sleep. The bus made the long final run, marking time in smooth, square particles. When she pulled into the bay to pause, she set the brake, signed the head sign out of service, and turned in her seat to note anything unusual on the paper log the depot still insisted on keeping. The section titled Incidents had an open-armed blankness to it. She wrote, "Announcements briefly misaligned. Resolved." And under that, as if it were equipment, she wrote, "Marrow acknowledged. Complete." When she did her walkthrough down the aisle, as drivers always do at the end of a loop, she found only a few ordinary leavings. A receipt, a water bottle, a single glove that had somehow stayed as a pair's dignified representative. Under the 4th row seat, where the light seldom reached, a paper wedge touched her shoe. She knelt and slid it out. It was a transfer slip, the old kind, soft and thick, time-worn edges with the city's emblem embossed too deeply from an old die. The punch marks told a time long used up. The destination line read the new name of the corner, that had used to be Marrow. On the back, in pencil so faint the paper seemed to remember it rather than carry it, a note. Driver was kind. She did not bring it to Lost and Found right away. She set it on the dash, near the other small pieces of navigation that made a night go the way nights were supposed to. The radio murmured the voices of other buses on other streets, delivering other people to other ends. The depot, somewhere far back, counted the arrivals. The city changed gears. Lena placed the transfer into the clear pocket of the log binder when she returned to the depot, letting it press flat, like a pressed leaf that had not been plucked but had arrived. The next night, the route card still read its list. The head sign worked. The doors did what doors do. When the bus approached the old corner, the pull in her shoulder did not return. The stop request chime stayed ordinary. Outside, at a bench under a streetlight that had nothing particular to recommend it, an orange scarf lay folded, as if a passenger had tucked summer away and gone inside. She did not stop. She did not need to. The scarf became a color the city knew how to keep without assistance. Later, weeks down the line, a new driver would inherit 517 for a shift. That driver would set a coffee in the cup holder and notice a transfer slip in the clear pocket of the log binder. A scrap of paper that did not look like it belonged to any schedule still in circulation. They would leave it where it was, because people who drive at night pick up an instinct for what to keep near and what to send away. The bus, in its patience, would make the long loop and the short one, would speak the names it was told, and would accept small courtesies extended to streets that have not had their names on anyone's lips for years. That is one of the ways a city lets the dark be dark without losing its roads. Story number 4. The lyric stage was the only place in town that glowed when everything else slept. One bare bulb on a pole stood at center, the ghost light, a patient sun for velvet night. Nia liked the way the floor remembered every tap shoe, how the boards murmured a low, warm note when her boots crossed from wing to wing. The house seats breathed in rows, red velvet dark as dried cherries. Somewhere high above, the grid held its breath, and sandbags rested like polite planets. There was no show scheduled. The cast had closed last weekend. The lobby still smelled faintly of lilies from someone's congratulations. Nia had come to rebuild the cue stack on the light board after a firmware hiccup erased what it shouldn't. The building keys chimed once on her belt, then settled. She signed in on the clipboard under the word crew, and wrote the time without noticing she had written it small and careful, as if the paper were listening. She set her headset on the prompt desk, opened the binder, and saw handwriting that wasn't hers. Not bold, not a scrawl. A neat, small hand that favored the left margin. It had not been there yesterday. Hold 8 counts for balcony door. Seat J12 will cough. Wait for it. Nia smiled, because theaters collect notes the way luggage collects stickers. Maybe an old stage manager's annotations, pressed between pages and woken by a draft. She checked the wall clock that never ever agreed with her phone, and set the console to manual. The dimmer rack hummed like a cat. House to half, she said out of habit, without pressing the button, and felt silly. Then the exit signs along the aisles softened half a shade, and the ghost light's glow bent as if a breeze had crossed it. She did not touch the switch. She looked at the console. Channel levels stayed flat. Somewhere, something complied gently. On.com, the base station clicked as if a thumb had tested it far away. She lifted the headset. Ops, she said, calling a person who wasn't there. A quiet filled the band that wasn't static. Then a voice. Not a voice exactly, but the soft enumeration theater people use when they are saying important things as if they are ordinary. Standby rail 2. Standby sound A. Standby house to 0. Lights 14 on the go. Her finger hovered above the go key. Nothing lit. Copy standbys, she said, because it felt rude not to. The ghost light put a pale coin on the center cross. The ropes at the fly rail shifted a fraction, a gentle settling. She walked to stage right and checked the rope locks one by one, palm on cold iron, numbers chalked neat. At line set 2, the lock hung pinned but unlatched, the kind of in-between that made a person's nerves stand up. She clicked it closed. The baton above sighed, grateful to be told exactly what to do. Back at the prompt desk, a fresh pencil line had appeared on the page, just above a coffee ring she didn't recognize. After you pin 2, put tape over the trap hinge. It wants to forget. She crouched at the upstage corner where the trap was marked with a rectangle of scratch and history. The hinge had a whisper to it, a shyness. She tore 2 lengths of spike tape, bright and reassuring, and crossed them over the seam. The tape made that soft rip theater tape makes, a sound that could convince a room it had been sealed even if the room knew better. In the wing, the quick change rack stood with 3 costumes and no one inside them. A stool, warmed by no one's weight, waited near the mirror. A makeup towel lay folded into a perfect square. The quiet had the personality of someone who chooses their words with care. Nia flicked the soundboard on and found the presets blank, as expected. A playlist she did not create sat on the screen anyway, named House Pre. The tracks were titles she didn't recognize. Warm Walk, Curtain Breath, The Street Outside at 11. She slid Fader one up a hair, just to see. A waltz seeped into the room from nowhere obvious. Thin as lace, no melody she could hum later. The speakers barely moved the air, but the curve of the balcony seemed to lean in to catch it. "Half hour," she said into the headset, because ritual is a way to tidy what can't be sorted. The green room door sighed. Somewhere down a stair, the dryer clicked itself off. One exit sign blinked as if to say a small hello. Nia felt the tiniest press of emotion, the one that arrives when something you love feels back. She walked up the aisle to the last row, where seat H4 creaked the way it had since the Lyric was a movie house. She sat a moment and let the bulb at center be a star. The ghost light cracked the stage in 2 neat halves, and the dust picked a dance partner in its beam. From here, the set looked like a dream held on pause. The little kitchen table, the practical lamp with its yellow shade, the door with no hallway beyond it, the painted window showing a neighborhood invented from wood and patience. The air above the orchestra pit felt a degree cooler, as if the river that used to run under the block had leaned up to listen. Back at the desk, the binder's next page turned by itself half an inch, like a person clearing their throat to speak. The pencil hand had left more. "If thunder is late, skip it. Don't make the room lie." And below that, faint, almost shy, as if the paper were reluctant to admit it had heard anything. "Thank you for closing too. Who are you then?" she said to the space, not expecting an answer. Only the grid replied, a long, soft creak that old buildings make to remind you they can hold you. At midnight, the house computer beeped once it signaled to itself that all was well. The headset clicked again. "Warning, midnight check." "The not," voice murmured. "Kind." As a patient teacher, cue to black in 12. Nia stood by the ghost light, ready to grab the pole if the room decided to prove a point. At 12 past, every exit sign breathed down to a lower pulse. The bulb at center dimmed just enough to make panic consider the room, then thought better of it, and brightened again to the level of polite conversation. A test, and a kindness. In the lobby, the poster frames held last week's show with the dates gone. On the floor by the box office window, something lay where no draft should have placed it. Nia picked it up. A program from decades ago, yellowed in a friendly way, the Lyric's name in a font too proud for its age. She flipped to the crew list. Under deck, a last name she knew because it was her own. A relative? The town pressed families into each other so gently sometimes, she only noticed when paper told her. She brought the program back to the prompt desk and set it under the lamp. The binder seemed to read over her shoulder. The next line in that tidy hand. Line, set 7. Listen. Atop the rails, a pulley gave a small complaint, then a longer, comfortable hum. She walked to the fly rail again and laid her ear near the wood. A strand in the rope had begun to separate. She taped it. Sometimes fixing is nothing more than paying that kind of attention. A soft squeak from upstage left drew her. Between the curtain legs, a narrow door to a storage nook had been wedged open with a paint can. She had not left it that way. Inside, shelves held props no one had asked for in years. A violin with no strings, a tin star, 3 wooden bowls that had played soup in 11 separate plays. On the top shelf, a paper envelope slept. On it, a word. Applause. She opened and found a small handful of silver confetti, perfect circles like tiny moons. She smiled and felt silly for smiling about circles. Back at the desk, the cue pages had acquired a single sentence across the bottom margin, horizontal and firm, like someone setting a bar. Bring in safety 1 foot. Show the room you remember. The safety curtain had not been lowered in years. It was a good curtain, heavy, obedient, comforting the way a thick blanket is comforting. She unlocked the lever and eased it. The steel edge slid down a foot with the dignity of an elevator in an old movie and stopped when she told it to. A whisper moved through the house, the sound of static waking and going back to sleep. Dust rose in the ghost light and hung there like calm snow. She lifted the curtain back to its cradle and latched it. The word thank you did not appear anywhere, but she felt it, the same way you feel a person nod when you are both facing forward. In the mirror at the quick change station, she saw the stage behind her, multiplied. The stool's cushion had a small indentation now, where no weight had been. She considered placing a prop there, then left it empty, a reserved seat for someone who believed in cues. The headset breathed. "Places," said the not voice. And Nia looked up at nothing and nodded out of habit. The house took the instruction in the only way a house can. A door under the balcony eased into its jam. The thermostat thought and changed its mind. The waltz on the playlist found its end and let silence stand where it had been. She called her own standbys to the air. Standby sound, standby rail, standby lights. It was like warming up a ghost arm with a ghost barbell. "Lights go," she said, and let her hand fall to the desk, gentle. The ghost light did not change, but in her mind, a wash rose and softened, the way color climbs a wall at dawn. "Sound go," she said, and heard the room become itself a degree louder, the way crowds become collective even when there are not enough people to make a crowd. "Rail go," she whispered, and somewhere above, a weight arranged itself more comfortably. There was no fear in any of it, only the old sensation of a group deciding to do something together. Nia opened the binder to the last page. The neat small hand had left a line there as well, darker, as if pressed harder than the others. "When you lock up, leave a word for us on the prompt desk. Not a name, just a word the floor can keep." She tore a strip of spike tape, wrote on it with the blunt pencil, and pasted it to the edge of the desk where no one would scrape it off by mistake. The word was simple and not hers, and it would not mean much to anyone else. Ready. She moved through closing. Work lights. Console to off. Headset coiled. The ghost light remained at center. A faithful planet. She wielded a fraction so its circle of light touched the spot where actors always caught their breath before a line. It felt right. It felt like straightening a picture frame in a stranger's house. As she passed down the aisle, she stopped at seat J12 and listened. A cough rose from nowhere in particular. The sort of cough people try to hide in their hands. She smiled without meaning to, because some notes keep their dates. On stage, the quick change mirror showed the ghost light like a second small moon. Everything else kept still. She locked the side exit and stood for a moment in the alley where old posters had left rectangles on brick. The night air carried a trace of sawdust, as if a day from long ago had exhaled, and the breeze had kept a souvenir. From inside, very faintly, a patter, like fingers against cloth, tapped once. Applause is a big word. This wasn't that. It was something smaller and as good. In the morning, no one would see the tape on the trap hinge but her. The cue stack would rebuild clean. The board would behave. A carpenter would find a rope without a fray. Someone would ask who taped over the hinge and she would shrug and say, "It wanted it." The program with the old crew list would return quietly to the lobby frame. Theater people know how to make small mercies look like checklists. On the last step up to the stage door, she paused and looked back into the dark house. The ghost light shone like a promise kept. The red aisle lights described a path that could be taken by memory alone. "Good night," she said finally, because speaking to a room is one way to remind it that it is full. The door sighed behind her. The bar slid into place without argument. Blocks away, the lyric sat with its bulb and its dust and its rails and thought whatever buildings think when a person has helped them remember their job. The word ready hung under the prompt desk where only the floor could read it, and the floor did. Holding it the way a path holds the idea of footsteps whether or not anyone is walking. Story number 5. The tower above the town hall had a way of keeping the dark in tune. 4 faces looked out over 4 directions, each a pale moon with iron hands. Inside, the clock's heart lived in a room of wood and brass, a pendulum long as a person, and a drum wound with cables thick as wrists. Jonah liked the place best when everyone else forgot it existed. The smell of oil and dust felt honest. The stairs up were narrow and honest, too, the kind of climb that made breathing take its time and then reward it. He had the keys, the logbook, the small cloth bag of wrenches that belonged only to this machine. He set them on the work table where the lamp burned a soft cone, and the ledger waited open to pages filled by older hands. The town slept below like a cat, all knees and windows. The bell above him held its breath, heavy in its cradle. He wound the clock the way his predecessor had taught him. Not all the way to the stop, never a full turn more than kindness. The weights liked a margin. The crank handle warmed to his palm. The cables lifted their burdens with a patient, grainy sound. The escapement ticked and talked in a rhythm that had space in it, a rhythm that could accept a thought between beats. At 11:58, the north face showed a minute ahead of the east. It always did. The prevailing wind leaned harder on the east, and glass suffered in ways only those who look from inside notice. Jonah made a tiny adjustment with the regulator nut at the top of the pendulum, the kind of adjustment that would annoy a person impatient for results. The room accepted it without commentary. The ledger's last entry, written by a hand steadier than his, read, "Storm week. Let her lose 30 seconds. The town will sleep softer." Beneath it, in lighter pencil, another hand had once written, "If you hear the train at 1 to 10, you are listening backward. Nothing to fix." He closed the book to the ribbon and listened for a minute. The town's small nocturnal machinery made a net of sound: refrigerators, a distant transformer, the occasional soft laugh from an open window where someone watched late movies. The tower joined that net with its steady measure. He leaned his forearm on the sill of the little maintenance hatch that opened behind the west dial and watched the hands from the wrong side, their shadows sliding like careful fish behind frosted glass. At midnight, the bell did as it was asked, 12 notes, spaced with dignity, each one carrying through the ribs of the town and settling without argument into curtains and pillows. A light in an upstairs bedroom went out in the moment between the 11th and 12th. Jonah marked it in his head for no reason other than it felt like a private tradition. To choose one small light and imagine it heard him. The quarter hours went easily. He checked the hammers, cleaned a bit of soot off the striker where metal met bell, tightened one bolt on a brace that had developed a habit of pretending to be loose. He took a stool and sat by the pendulum, watching its brass bob swing with the curiosity of a planet. The pendulum talked, not in words, but in a language of length and patience. It told him when the air grew heavier. It told him when he had changed the room by leaning on the table. At 12:32, the tick changed. Not a fault, not a warning. The tooth on the escape wheel took a slightly different sort of step. Jonah stood and put a hand near the crutch that carried the pendulum's intent to the gear. The pressure changed beneath his skin, the way one can feel a cat pass by in the dark without touching it. He watched the minute hand through the glass. It advanced, then hesitated as if waiting for someone on a staircase, then advanced again. He opened the ledger and found, several pages back, a note in that older, neat hand. When the tick anticipates itself, the west face is impatient. Open the hatch and let the cold in for a count of 20. He smiled at the specificity, and he did as asked. The night air slid over his knuckles. By count 13, a draft rose like a question under the bell. By count 20, the tick had settled into the exact same distance it had, always kept between itself and its twin. He closed the hatch. Below, a late truck made a shy noise, as if apologizing for driving on a road that thought it belonged to birds at this hour. He set the crank back on its peg and walked the narrow catwalk that circled the backs of the dials. The west face, with its impatience, showed exactly 12:34. He counted the faint bubbles and scratches in the glass he knew by now, as a person knows freckles on their own arms. The north face showed the same. The east, nudged by the river's breath, lagged that polite minute. As he returned to the heart of the room, something small brushed the floor by his boot. He looked down. A rectangle of paper had slid out from behind a beam, not fallen, exactly, but arrived. It was a ticket stub from a festival the town had hosted decades ago. One of those events that made photographs of children on shoulders and long strings of lights. On the back, in pencil, someone had drawn a circle and two short radiating lines. No letters, but clear enough to a person who lived by gears. He checked the great wheel and found the two teeth the pencil meant. One had polished itself a shade more than its neighbors. He smoothed the burr with a square of very fine emery, careful as a person helping another untangle a necklace. The lever that tripped the quarter-hour hammer had always needed a small kindness. Tonight, it wanted a shade more. He lifted, eased again. The hammer lay back, as if remembering how to rest. The next quarter came, and the bell made a tone that walked across the roof and seemed to hesitate at the edges of town, listening for an echo from hills that answered only in purple. He had never met the previous caretaker. He knew him in pieces. Shorthand margins, a particular brand of pencil, a tendency to notch small marks into wood, counting with cuts rather than numbers. In the corner near the ladder, 5 notches, then 5 below them, then 3, then a space, then a single notch. Jonah had never decided if it was a date or an apology. He had added his own mark below last winter when he replaced a frayed cable. It felt like writing a name on a low beam near the floor, not for anyone to see except those who already belonged there. At 1:03, a gust pressed the east face like a thought. The hand wobbled and recovered itself. The pendulum told him nothing in panic. The room breathed. He sat again, the stool creak making him feel suddenly much larger than the mechanism, and then much smaller. It was easy in a tower at night to think the town depended on exactly what you did, that if you allowed the bell to ring late, a person would miss a bus, or overproof a dough, or say yes at an unintended time. It was also easy to remember that people had clocks in their pockets now, and that the bell was more companion than commander. Jonah liked both truths. They made the work directional, without being heavy. A soft vibration in the rope of the bell told him the line downstairs by the bell frame wanted attention. He took the long wrench and went down 2 landings, past the small dusty lamp with the green shade that no one had thrown away because they felt it might be important someday. There, by the frame, a washer had loosened. He tightened it. The rope stopped humming. When he came back up, the pendulum welcomed him with the same posture, the way a friend keeps their seat for you when you step away. A minute before 1:15, he heard it, the faint horn of a train that did not run this late anymore. It came from somewhere behind his ear rather than outside. He stood very still. The ledger had said that backward listening meant nothing needed to be done. He took it at its word. The horn faded, like a memory mistranslated by air. The bell marked the quarter. Below, somewhere in the blocks around the station that had become a cafe and a handful of offices, a man turned a page. When he made the small, nightly adjustment, barely a breath's worth of turn on the rating nut, he left the ledger open and wrote that he had done it, with the time, and with a line he had begun to add on nights that felt weird in ways that were hard to name. Room feels light. He did not know what anyone else would understand by that, but the room would, and that felt sufficient. The rail of the catwalk near the south face had a habit of singing once when the temperature changed. It sang now, a high, single note, a polite thread across the ear. He checked the face and saw, faintly, the reflection of a bicycle light crossing the square below, moving slow enough to suggest a person thinking hard about something and letting their feet do the keeping of balance. He stepped back, and the reflection broke. The minute hand continued its small, faithful journey. By 2 o'clock, the heavy feeling that sits on all things in the middle of the night had given way to something easier. The town's breathing had evened out. The bell did its work without asking for praise. Jonah cleared a corner of the work table and found, under a cloth, a little brass metronome that did not belong to a clock tower at all. It must have been a conductor's at some point. The town had once had more music than it did now. He set the metronome because he wanted to hear something count besides the machine and himself. The metronome ticked. For a measure or two, it argued with the pendulum, arrogant in its insistence. Then, as if having been caught being rude, it softened and slipped into the tower's pace. He laughed at the smallness of the victory. Somewhere beneath the floor, a pigeon turned carefully on its roost. There were no messages after that, not written ones. The tower had chosen to speak in hardware and small offers. At 2:37, the pendulum made the tiniest knock as its rod warmed 1 degree and lengthened a hair. He adjusted nothing, because part of maintenance is letting a thing prove it can tend itself. At 2:50, the strain on the quarter hammer changed by a fraction. He moved the counterweight the width of a coin. At 3, rain visited for 3 minutes, and left without wetting anything enough to count. The east face looked relieved. He made tea on a coil burner that had gone up the stairs with him the first week he took the key. Steam rose and hung in the light like something being stored for later. He drank and let his eyes grow soft the way people do who have decided nothing requires them for a minute. The bell's striker settled, ready for the next hour. The town, seen through the thin, pearl glass behind the dial, made a gentle mosaic without edges. At 3:20, the logbook's ribbon slipped toward the older pages. He steadied it and found beneath it a note he had not noticed before, written very small, almost shy. "If you ever need to, you can let us be early once. Only once. Choose well." He left the ribbon where it had fallen and closed the book. Behind the glass, a stair light in a building opposite flicked on and off, as someone changed their mind about water. He did not choose to make anything early that night. Nothing in the room asked him to. The pendulum counted. The bell complied. The four faces agreed more than they disagreed. That felt like enough. When the first paler line pulled itself across the eastern street, showing Jonah the hint of puddles that had not been there before, he wound the weights a little, wiped the brass where his breath had fogged it, and tightened the latch on a door that liked to pretend it couldn't. He wrote in the ledger the time he would return in the afternoon to check the hinges. He put one careful line under the note about being early, as if to underline a vow to wait. On his way down, he paused by the small green-shaded lamp and tried its switch. It did not come on. It made a choice not to. He smiled at that. In the hall outside the clock room, half a dozen photographs hung of town parades and speeches no one remembered. One showed the tower itself, its faces all a little too white, the bell frozen mid-swing. In the bottom corner, in ribboned ink, someone had written a single word. Listen. He stepped out into the cool gray before the town stretched. The tower behind him took a breath and began to pour its time into the street as if it were water. And the hour hand a careful spout. A man opening his bakery door glanced up and nodded toward nothing, a greeting to a habit shared. A woman walking her dog looked at her watch out of habit, and then at the tower, and the two agreed like friends. Jonah put the key in his pocket. The mechanism upstairs would keep moving after he'd left. The room would remember the small kindnesses, and would forget little mistakes, as long as he didn't insist on them. The bell would say good morning the same way it always did. For a second, the sound of a long-ago train crossed the edge of hearing, and disappeared into the day. A rumor the sunlight refused to repeat. Story number 6. Night at the Finch Hotel moved like carpet underfoot, quiet, even, sturdy. The lobby's lamps wore shades the color of warm tea. A little fountain near the elevators stitched a soft line through the silence. Cass liked the hours when the revolving door turned only for the air itself. The front desk was his island. A polished counter, a property management screen that blinked in patient blues, a thermal printer that sighed out folios in curled ribbons. He ran the day close, checked a late check-in into 12:15, coded a key for a guest who'd taken the wrong elevator bank, and ended up staring at a service door, calmed her with a map and a joke. When the lobby was empty again, he set the night audit preparation reconcile, roll house, queue reports, but did not press the button that would turn one day into the next. Not yet. The hotel preferred the moment held until the minute had the right shape. At 1:07, the elevator relays clicked softly to themselves, habit, not request. The flame of the candle on the lobby table tilted, then steadied. The air conditioning had thought about a different speed and stayed where it was. Cass straightened the stack of spare key packets, wrote the weather on the cardstock easel by the concierge's stand clear, 58 degrees, quiet, sunrise 6:21, and pressed his palm flat on the counter to remind his posture to be good. The system's rooming list displayed the people asleep above him in orderly lines. 14th floor occupied light, 8th light, a scattering. There was no 13th floor at the Finch. The elevator buttons leapt from 12 to 14 with a small, polite fiction the building had practiced for decades. As the minute ticked toward 1:15, a new line blinked itself into the list without fanfare, as if it had always been there and had simply asked for attention again. 1,304. Hold 1 courtesy R. 11:50 p.m. Dep 3 a.m. Cass stared at the number and waited for the brain's quick ability to put what it sees into a sensible drawer. The Finch's schedules sometimes imported old templates. Once a banquet from 5 years ago had briefly claimed the ballroom for itself. He clicked the line. A simple card of details opened. Name, rate, $0. Notes, hold. He checked the floor plan. The blueprint in the back office showed floors stacked like piano keys. 10, 11, 12. Mezzanine, 14. No 13. He had seen older prints framed near the elevator mechanicals, yellow paper with neat ink and rules of a different time. Those had a 13. The building had changed stories, that was all. He told himself the system was remembering something that did not need to be remembered. He tried to clear the entry. The cursor hesitated, then returned to exactly where it had been on its own. The button to cancel was gray. The house count atop the screen adjusted itself by 1, and then, with a small shrugging animation he had never seen, split into in-house and a new tag, courtesy. The number 1 rested by it, modest as a coat on a hook. The front desk phone, which was also the courtesy phone, rang once and stopped, a single punctuation mark. He lifted it anyway. The kind of silence that lives in carpeted rooms breathed down the line. Then he thought he heard someone set a suitcase on a hall runner 2 floors up. He realized the line had no connection tone. He replaced the receiver gently and told himself it must have been the elevator accepting weight and letting it go. He walked his rounds with the master key not out of suspicion but because the building liked to be seen by someone who cared about its corners. The meeting rooms sat in their dark coats. The ballroom breathed a bigger darkness softly. On 12, a room service tray waited by a door. He eased it aside so no one would trip at dawn. He checked the exit signs, green and patient, checked the ice machines, which whispered to themselves as if telling the floor a story the floor had heard before. On 14, the elevator doors opened with a smile's hiss. The hallway carpet was the same pattern it had been on 12, roses and vines and a border that had always been a little wrong by one sketched leaf. A housekeeping cart slept by the linen closet like a horse at rest. Cass wrote a note for morning. Please check 1,412 latch. Loose. He had time to do the small kindnesses that lived on lists and at their edges. He stood at the window at the end of the hall and watched the village lights beyond the hotel's green roofline. A train on the far tracks threw a stripe of motion. Impossible this late. And he remembered that sometimes the sound of one from earlier in the evening took its time arriving inside him. As the elevator carried him down again, the panel's numbers blinked the polite sequence 1412L, no 13. Yet the maintenance log on the interior screen, which only staff saw, recorded the smallest entry, 126 service stop 13 door hold, 08. Cass frowned not because he felt threatened, but because system logs were supposed to be mercilessly literal. He wiped the panel with a cloth just to do something while thinking. The number stayed good and impossible. Back at the desk, the night audit waited. He watched the seconds on the clock on the wall gather themselves into a line that felt right. He pressed the key, the printer whirred, and began to spit out the elegant nonsense that meant day had folded over the spine of the book. Trial balance, batch close, revenue by department, long paper in small stacks. A narrow, softer paper joined the pile. Occupancy by floor. The numbers made sense until they did not. FL 126. FL 149, FL Courtesy 1. He did not know a printer could print a floor that did not exist. He put the strip under the paperweight that looked like a river stone and let it be a curiosity. There were enough curiosities in every building to furnish a museum, he thought. Most of them did their work and asked for nothing. The concierge desk held a binder of old menus and a drawer of things left by people in their pockets. Someone had once labeled the drawer Grant Box after a manager who had invented the tidy system. Cass opened it to put in a scarf from the bar. In the back, under a couple of key tags that belonged to a time before plastic, a small envelope lay. Thin cream paper, hotel crest from a different logo generation. The front read, in pencil, one word, hold. He turned it over, half expecting to see someone's joke, a staff tradition that would end in a smile. Only the seal, unbroken, waited. He did not open it. He set it atop the printer for memory's sake. The fountain took a breath it did not need. Its little pump sounded different for 3 seconds and then went back to work. Cass looked up at the elevator camera feed, a friendly mosaic that showed the doors, the lobby, the empty hall by the conference wing. The leftmost square flickered, replaced itself with a view not on the list for a heartbeat. A hallway too narrow. Baseboards a darker wood. A lamp with a drum shade resting on a half-moon table. The view felt closer than their halls allowed, as if the walls had leaned in. Then it corrected to the blank elevator, waiting. He left the monitor on and poured coffee into a mug with the hotel's name in a font. The marketing team had only recently decided was out of date. The coffee tasted the way coffee tastes after midnight, more idea than drink. He told himself it did the job anyway. At 2:03, a guest's door on 6 clicked quietly closed with a preference for not waking anyone. The night had perfected the art of making assumptions you could live with. Cass printed the arrivals report for the day that had just begun. A name at the bottom had no phone number, no email, no loyalty number. It wore only a single word where a surname should be. Courtesy. The room assigned. 1304. He took the key drawer's half-emptied roll of cards and thought, not to encode one, it would be a waste of a card, but to humor the system by letting it think he had. He slid a blank into the slot. The encoder hummed, thought, and spit it back without a mag stripe written, the display reading simply, "Hold." He laughed out loud for the first time that night, because an inanimate object had matched his joke by accident. At 2:17, the elevator chimed, though he had not called it. The doors opened 2 inches and closed again, without impatience. The indicator above the door showed no number at all for a moment, just a pale dash, and then filled itself with L as if it had thought better of something. The fountain seemed to listen. The building felt braced without being tense, like a person sitting very still so as not to disturb a bird that had landed on their hand. At 2:41, the courtesy phone rang once and stopped, then repeated the same thing a minute later. On the second ring, Cass answered and said, "Front desk." He heard what sounded like the soft clack of an old luggage cart moving across wood. He waited. A voice did not arrive. A feeling did a request with no words. "Keep the light steady." He looked at the lamp on the concierge's desk. It had dimmed itself a hair from the bulb's long hours. He turned the switch and it brightened, only a little. The line went dead gently, the way a book closes when the story has stepped out of it. He glanced again at the envelope that said "Hold." He did not open it. He slipped it into the grant box where the lost things waited to be wanted again. If the building had a ritual, he had participated in it to the extent that a person can, by keeping the part of it that involved not prying. At 3 exactly, the printer that had finished its work earlier woke to print one last stub. It read, 1304, checked out 3 a.m. Thank you. The words arranged themselves as if they were nothing more than a format. The stub had no room to hold a gratitude, but it had found a way. He stepped away from the desk and walked to the revolving door. Outside, the city had grown a shade of gray, the color of polite shoulders on a bus at dawn. He pressed a palm to the glass and felt the cool. The door turned itself 2 lazy degrees and settled. The plaza's pavers held an early leaf that had fallen out of season. He looked up at the hotel, at the windows asleep and polite. Halfway up, between where the building said 12 and 14, there was only brick and window and nothing anyone would call a floor. He could have sworn he saw a lit rectangle slide past, low and warm as the glow under a hallway lamp. He blinked, and it was only brick again, only window, only what the mind asks the eyes to return. He ran the remaining reports, stacked the paper under the stone, wrote in the log that 1,412 latch was loose, that 604's tray had been brought in, that the fountain had briefly cleared its throat. He added a line he didn't expect to write but did anyway. Courtesy resolved. Not because anyone would understand it later, but because the page would, and sometimes that had to be good enough. At 4:10, the pastry baker arrived, hair under a scarf, shoulders making the half-shrug people have at that hour before language fully wakes. She waved. He waved back. The elevator took her to the mezzanine obediently, and did not pause where it could not pause. At 4:30, the first plane passed far above, its sound placing a transparent cup over the hotel, lifting and moving on. The lobby smelled faintly of yeast from the cafe, faintly of copper from the fountain, faintly of something old and polite in the wood that held the front desk up. The day clerk would arrive in 45. Cass would count his drawer, write his note, and go out into the small cool. He would not tell anyone about a room that wasn't a room. He did not think it was a story to be told. It was a duty performed, a thing held and then released in the hour requested. In the maintenance office later that week, he would find a paper tacked to the corkboard behind a safety poster. A diagram of the elevator bank from years ago, floors labeled all the way through. The 13th floor had the same neat squares as the others. In pencil at the margin, in a hand that had probably also labeled coffee cans with screws in them, one word: courtesy. He would nod, because sometimes agreement is not spoken to a person. He shut down the desk lamp, left the lobby lights as they like to be before sunrise, and walked to the door that led to the back hallway. On a hook there, among D&D signs and luggage tags, and 2 umbrellas used to shepherd people smiling from cabs to awnings in weather, he hung a single spare room key packet, empty, with one word he wrote on it in small, careful letters: hold. Story number 7. The conservatory slept with its eyes open. Glass panes arched like gentle ribs over palms and paths, and fans breathed a steady hymn along the rafters. At night, the rooms traded their daytime brightness for a softer, deeper green. Eliza walked the connecting corridors with a key ring and a thermos, listening to the great house of leaves do its patient work. The Finch Conservatory had 4 halls: Palm House, Fern Grotto, Desert House, and the little orchid lane that curved behind a hedge of philodendron, as if shy to be seen. She checked the control panel where the air and water were measured into numbers. The display glowed with the quiet pride of a thing that knows how to behave. Temperature steady. Humidity. A modest sky. Vents half open to admit the cool. She logged readings in calm handwriting and set the pen down the way a person sets a briefcase down beside a chair they know well. At 12:19, the Palm House glass exhaled a slow cloud over the entrance door. Condensation gathered and ran with purpose, not random at all, drawing 2 neat strokes that crossed and then parted into a sentence, only clear if a person agreed to see it as one. East vent 2 inches. Eliza smiled because words found strange paths in this place. On wet mornings coming off heat waves, she'd seen the labels on plant stakes absorb dew and darken a different word for an hour. She lifted the long pole and nudged the east vent along its track. The air shifted without complaint. A sheet of broad leaves settled their tremble. In the desert hall, 2 rooms away, a piece of dry bark ticked as if remembering rain. On the slate at the Palm House entrance, where docents wrote notes about bloom schedules, a line had appeared beneath today's neat warnings. Walk carefully. Paths may be slick. Please do not touch the cacao pods. The chalk was a thin white whisper. Do not swat the big moth when you see it. It has a job. Eliza had never troubled a moth. Still, she nodded at the advice as if it had come from a person she had known a long time. She made rounds. In the Fern Grotto, misters hissed and fell silent, leaving a veil shaking like a pulled curtain. The air smelled like clean stone and the first page of a book. She stooped to straighten the tag on a tree fern that wore its dates in ink too faded now. When she set it right, she saw a shallow dent in the damp gravel, shaped like the polite place where someone might rest a knee. No footprints led to it. The dent filled with a bead of clear water as she watched, and then the water released itself and ran off down the line of the path. At 12:41, the little intercom by the potting room flicked quietly. Security, said a voice she knew. The night guard on the far side of the complex. All quiet on the courtyard. If you hear the bins, it's the wind, or raccoons who studied the schedule. Eliza pressed the talk button, smiled into it, and said, "Copy. If you see a light in Orchid Lane, it will be mine." She did not mention the words on the glass or the note about the moth. Some nights were made gentler by leaving their strange angles unnamed. In Desert House, the warm air held its breath. Agaves presented their armor without apology. A barrel cactus looked like a green globe a child had rolled pins into while thinking about stars. The sensor light above the door had always had a faint flicker. Tonight it held steady, as if being watched made it agree to as few surprises as possible. A rattling whisk against glass startled her, until she saw it was a dry mesquite twig tapping the pane because the temperature had made it move just that much. The sticker on the pane read, in tiny letters, "Do not lean ladders here." Eliza wasn't carrying a ladder. She pressed her palm to the glass to feel how the night worked on it and drew back when the cold tried to walk into her hand. On the low bench near the send pathway, someone had set a foam wedge. She didn't remember leaving it there. The wedge belonged against the lip of a planter where a stone had moved and wanted to ding a neighboring trunk when the floor shook. She lifted the wedge to carry it there and found underneath a piece of paper that had been protected from damp A photocopied page from an old plant list. The header, Finch Conservatory, Series B. The entry was for Selenocerius grandiflorus, night-blooming cereus. Notes. Flowers open for a few hours after midnight. Fragrance. Heavy. Sweet. Assistance. Moths. She tucked the paper into her pocket, as if it had been handed to her. Back in the palm house, the tall leaves had become a little bell orchestra. She stood still, and the room allowed her to hear the specific voices hidden in its blend. Palm fronds taking turns with their tiny rattles. The drip at the edge of a gutter counting its own seconds. The almost inaudible trickle of a pipe far above when a valve thought about itself and returned to what it was doing. On the glass door of Orchid Lane, Dew traced 2 letters and stopped, as if that was all the energy it had tonight. W-A. She waited, not quite patient, and after a long breath, another line joined the first to make what might be a word or a fragment. Wait. She did. The door's thumb latch was always a little stubborn. When she tried it after waiting, it gave easily, like a sentence that had finally found its verb. Orchid Lane lived up to its reputation for being farther than it looked. The curve hid more curve and the window boxes hid more windows. The lights along the baseboards glowed like a trail someone had stitched. Halfway down, a shadow stepped between 2 hanging baskets and paused. It was only a shadow, but it had the politeness of a person noticing that someone else was coming and choosing to keep clear. She held still, because it felt right to honor that kind of courtesy. The shadow thinned, and stopped existing like a thought you realize you don't need anymore. At 1:33, the ceiling fan above the old citrus tree clicked as if clearing its throat. The small controller's screen showed a setting no one used. Reverse. Night. She left it. The air turned the other way, lifting, inviting. A moth arrived like a piece of silk on a whisper, and tested the current, finding its route as if given directions in a handshake. Its body cast a long, delicate shadow on a yellowing leaf. Eliza held her breath for no practical reason at all, until the moth caught a perfume line and zipped onward toward the room where the cactus waited. On a propagation bench, a notebook lay open to a blank page that had once had pencil on it, and now did not. The indentations in the paper still told their story. She angled the small desk lamp to catch the shallow relief, and the words surfaced. Pause northern fan for 3 minutes, at 1:47. She walked to the cabinet and pressed the button, and watched the space learn a new stillness. In that stillness, the moth moved the way a thought moves when nothing interrupts it. A white bud on the long arm of a cactus loosened its edges. The air learned how to carry something new. There are alarms meant to catch human mistakes, and alarms meant to let machines tell each other about thresholds. At 1:52, the panel's rainfall sensor thought the mist would be rain if the roof was a roof and not a shelter for a garden. It sent a soft nudge that would have closed 2 vents if nothing else had changed. Her earlier adjustment had given the system a reasonable argument to do nothing. It did nothing. The night preferred this path. In the fern grotto again, she knelt by a little stream that was not a stream at all, but a recirculating loop designed to seem like one. A tiny accumulation of leaf bits had built itself a dam against the filter grate. She cleared it with 2 fingers. The water's sound went from almost to something, a music note found that had been hiding under a couch. A metal placard beside a philodendron bore its Latin name, and a new sentence someone had etched so lightly that the light itself seemed to be what wrote it. Mulch, threshold. She carried a scoop to the doorway where cold met warm, and spread a line of bark over the spot where condensation always made a slick. No one would slip on it in the morning. A future passerby would only notice a small softness underfoot. At 2:11, the intercom breathed again. "You good?" the guard asked, voice part of the building now. "Good," she said, 1 moth on the clock. He laughed in the way people laugh when they register a thing as charming and slightly unreal. "Well, don't let it check in under a fake name. Night." The line clicked into sleep. She made tea in the potting room, steam fogging the little window that looked onto the cactus bench. In the fog, finger lines appeared from the other side, as neat as notes on a staff. 220 lights 1 step down. She dimmed the track lights to match the message and turned to the bench. In the hush, the cereus began to open. The process was a slow door. The pale petals uncurled without touching anything outside themselves and found the air. The smell arrived like something too sweet to be right. and then became right by being what it was. The moth came on cue, untroubled by the part it had been cast in. No one else would see it. No one else needed to. A few inches of time had gotten the exact thing it wanted. Eliza stood with her hands on the bench and let her attention become as careful as the flower. The bloom held a shape the night could wear without feeling costumed. After, the room felt taller by an inch. The vents accepted the dawn's decree in advance. She set the tea down and found on the bench a folded sheet she hadn't placed there. It was from an old catalog of greenhouse fittings, a page about sash weights and pulleys. Someone had circled a note. Maintain without forcing. She held the page the way one holds someone else's ticket when asked. At 3:05, a chill walked through the desert house that no one had ordered. The barrel cactus twanged faintly as metal does when temperature nudges it. She laid a cloth at the base of a pane where condensation had thought about pooling. A gecko revealed itself as a listening shape on a wall, then decided to be a gecko again and eased along the brick. Eliza watched it with the respect owed to anything trying to do its job in a room made for other beings. A bench at the far end had shifted a couple inches, as if a person had stood up and forgotten to push it back. Under its leg, she found the foam wedge she had moved earlier, now exactly where it should be. She looked up to see what it protected, and saw nothing in danger, only the idea of care carried forward by invisible hands. In the palm house, the glass declared a new word in its thin alphabet. Thank then lost its resolve as the fog thinned. She did not require the end of it to understand. She checked the panel, gave the east vent back an inch, balanced the west with a turn, felt the plants adjust if that was what they did, like an audience settling into a second act. Before locking up, she wrote on the slate where docents left their chalked messages. She did not write about moths or vents or flowers opening under instructions written by air. She wrote a single word for the room to keep, one that was honest and did not belong to anyone. Root. She turned off the potting room lamp. The tracks dimmed themselves one shade further, the way courteous lights do when they understand the hour. On the way out, she walked the curve of Orchid Lane and paused where the word wait had been. The door sighed at her, passing like a big animal letting a child walk by. Somewhere above, the fans reversed on their own, sending warmth back down to the floor. Outside, the glass house looked like a moonlit ship. The horizon admitted a first suggestion of color, undecided between blue and something warmer. Eliza pulled the door softly until the lock settled, and the house behind it carried on, ticking and sighing and opening and closing in tiny civilized ways. In the morning, visitors would notice only that the floor wasn't slick, and a scent lingered near a cactus that was back to being only a spine and a memory. That would be sufficient. Story number 8. The dome opened like an eyelid. A hush of bearings, a thin seam of night, and then the slit of sky stood ready over Ridge Observatory. Mara set a gloved hand on the shutter rail, the way a person puts a palm on a shoulder they've known for years. The air had made up its mind cold, workable, the kind that kept the optics honest. Down below, the town wore its light loosely, a scattered necklace. The control room lived one level under the stars. Racks and monitors, a red lamp that saved night vision, a thermos with a lid that clicked like a small planet docking. The software loaded the night's plan as a polite list. Calibrations, Field 12, Field 14, Standard Star, Comet Track, Dawn Flats, no Field 13. Ridge didn't have one on paper. The program skipped the number without drama, the way the elevator at a downtown hotel skipped a button and pretended it was just math. Mara checked the wind, the dew point, the all-sky camera's discrete horizon. A thin arrow of cloud leaned near the west. The dome turned. Motors hummed with the intention of patient dogs. She clipped the lanyard of the dead man's switch to her sleeve, more for ritual than need. The handset with its coiled cord hung where a person had hung it for 20 years, and where it had always looked right. In the warm pool of the red lamp, a laminated card lived by the keyboard. It had been there on her first night. It had penciled notes added by different hands, each small improvement standing beside the printed checklist. Open shutters. Home RA divided by deck. Autofocus. Fine. FRC 0.3. Guide threshold low at first pass. Respect. Dome. Wind. Cool. Someone had added, in a neat margin script. Focus for the room. The words were the kind that made sense only if you already agreed with them. She slewed to the first field. The telescope found the eyepiece's memory of where stars had been the last time it asked. She engaged the guider. A bright punctum settled near the crosshair. The graph breathed up a gentle line, then smoothed. The first exposure began. The shutter gave its soft wing beat, and then steadied into silence. On the monitor, the field rose out of the dark, dots making a thought. The header information ticked across in the corner. Object, filter, exposure length, detector temperature, LST. She had always liked those 3 letters. Local sidereal time. The sky's idea of a clock. LST. 1 hour 12 minutes and 3 seconds. The way the letters sat together made a quiet word she never said out loud. Listen. A hum in the cable tray overhead reminded her to watch the slit. She glanced up at the camera view of the dome interior, the curve of ribs, the slit like a half-remembered smile. A bead of condensation hung on the rail and rolled, tracing a short line across paint, the color of boxed milk. It broke into 2 drops and left a crossing mark like a careless X. On the hand-painted sign by the manual brake, a label she'd never noticed had been stenciled a long time ago and darkened by time. Hold. She touched the brake out of affection. The radio on the shelf above the old coffee maker clicked to life at the hour, a time signal from a distant station carrying its small set of beeps into the room like a string of toys being pulled along a hallway. She matched the observatory computer's time against it by habit. They agreed with a tidiness that made her shoulders feel even with the floor. On the second exposure, a satellite cut the field as a thin, straight reflection of someone else's chores. She marked it in the log. On the third, a cluster on the southeast edge brooded, and then clarified 4 stars wrapped like a child's idea of a kite. She found their catalog numbers and felt the usual presence of people she'd never meet, strangers who had named patterns and hammered them into lists. The dome hummed, the world turned. She listened to a low sound the motors made when cold warmed a wire. A printed sky chart hung by the desk, clipped to a metal board. It had no reason to change, but as she turned back from the dome control, she noticed a faint pencil mark. She did not remember underlining a not remarkable asterism near the handle of the Little Dipper. A small note barely done. Early once. Not a command, not even a suggestion. A possibility. She made the shift to the next field. The tube moved with a confidence earned by repetition. In the guide camera, the pickoff mirror found the intended star and then paused, as if reconsidering, and chose one a fraction dimmer. The guider didn't usually get ideas. It held with the same patience anyway, steady as a person ready to pass a heavy bowl across a table. When she checked the finder at the corner of the main image, a blot of glow wandered into the field along the bottom edge, thin, tapered, like a brush of daylight that couldn't possibly be here. A comet, faint enough that the software's catalog had not bothered with it, slid slowly, compelled by a path written far away. The plan had printed, Comet, CV 21. As a later target, low. This wasn't that. She widened the field and saw the hairline of a tail become itself. The guider suggested more patience. She gave it. Another time signal walked through the room at 1:30, beeps like small stones set down on a table. She checked the comet's arc. In the log's notes column, she printed new letters neatly so her future self, or someone else, would not think she had scribbled a hint of wish. Unlisted. Courtesy. Track if seeing holds. On the dome cam, the seam where the 2 shutter plates met developed a pale bloom, no water, only air cooling faster than metal admits. The bloom traced a curve and then, with a composure the room liked, finished itself into a shape she could not call a word without deciding it was one. Ready. She did not say it. She did not point. She knew better than to disturb a thing that was managing itself. Her hand went to the focus knob anyway, and leaned a fraction. Enough to crisp a star's edge the way one might straighten a book on a shelf someone else cares about. The phone in the hallway outside the control room rang once and stopped. It was the landline that connected to the gate at the bottom of the access road. No one should be coming. She did not answer. The beeps at the top of the hour would have told them if the night had scheduled visitors. The silence afterward felt as kind as a person waving from a distance and then turning away to spare you the talk. She instructed the mount to pivot to a standard star. The mount decided, momentarily, to consult a different memory, then the right one. It settled on the star and stayed. She shot 3 exposures through a narrower filter, their numbers running politely at the bottom of the screen. In the second, a cosmic ray strike lit a hot streak across the detector, a small, false meteor. It wore the letter L for a quarter of a second before becoming only energy again, distributed where the math would know to subtract it. Back on the comet, the thin tail had learned to be a line. The autoguider, clever, had found a way to hold the comet instead of the field and let the stars smear themselves into truth. She watched the smears measure the minutes. The margin of the control window displayed recording in a font she'd read for years without liking. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard because she wanted to be ready to start the next frame early if the comet asked. The earlier pencil had offered that once. She did not want to use it carelessly. A small squeak somewhere up in the dome skein spoke of cold to metal. The building chose not to make it a problem. The room adjusted. In the log, last week's observer's handwriting had left a note. If the shutter drift is kind, be kind back. She glanced at the power readout and eased the shutter's duty by 1%. The drift calmed. Not because machines obey kindness, but because people who think in those terms often also think in increments that make sense. The comet approached the edge of the planned frame. She did not want to cut it as if it were a picture she could crop later. Without looking for permission from anyone beyond the card that had written focus for the room, she pressed the key 2 seconds before the timer would become bold, and then claimed the sequence early. The exposure began as if that had always been the plan. The next image captured the thin end of the tail with an exactness that felt disproportionate to the gesture invested. It would mean little outside this room and tomorrow's computer and next year's paper, but it meant something to the night. She thought of a drive out of town she once took, pulling over to let someone pass who had been behind her too close for comfort, and the small agreement that formed when both drivers acknowledged nothing except making room. On the all-sky camera, a faint streak marked a meteor's polite exit. The dome kept its mouth open the right amount. The concrete ring underfoot held steady. The red lamp hummed like a thought that would not lose itself if you set it down for a minute. Toward 4, the east collected a suggestion of lighter clay, the kind of color that convinces birds to consider opinions. She checked the plan and found the dawn flats waiting at the bottom of the list. Close slit to a hand's width. Rotator positions 0, 45, 90, 135. Get the sky even. She typed the commands. The dome obeyed. The detector drank evenly. On the exterior camera, the white of the dome picked up a gray that made it look more like bone than paint. Tape labels along the console edge caught the hints of day and gave their words back. One said reset and had been repaired twice. One said listen, placed by someone who had worked here before she had. One said root, and, though it referred to the storage directory the instrument wrote into, she let it mean something else for a second. The metal toggle for the emergency stop wore a red hood stamped with raised letters. Lift to release. Hold pressed. Once, then released. Her glove obscured the imprint for a moment. When she moved her hand, the word remained, and felt like it had been for her all along. She wrote in the log in her neatest block letters. Comet track courtesy early by 2 seconds caught tail end seeing held. She did not write any of the other things, the ones that would sound like ideas when they had only been the room cooperating with itself. She added, in the column that no instrument would ever read, a single word because sometimes paper holds things longer than walls. Steady. The dawn flats looked like abstractions from a museum gradients, squares, the faint textures of sky telling their gentle truths to a sensor that took them without attitude. She closed the slit. The shutter plates kissed, metal to metal, a familiar sound. The dome turned to park. The motors sighed. The time signal on the radio sang its last night beeps and became morning. Outside, wind moved through the scrub, with a kindness it did not owe anyone. The town collected its lights one by one. The Ridges Road took a shape again. Mara stood in the doorway where night does its last small job and looked up. The sky was taking its stars back at its preferred pace. She could not make out the comet by eye. That was fine. It had been seen. She pulled the door gently until the latch made its exact, well-practiced sound. The dome settled into its day posture. The building would keep the quiet, and the cooled glass would hold what work had been done like a circle of water holds a stone's memory. The logbook lay open on the console, the last line clean and dark. And now, the stories fall silent. The whispers fade, the shadows step back, and the night returns to its steady breath. What remains are echoes, quiet and waiting, carried gently into sleep. The dark holds no more for now. Rest easy, let the stillness surround you, and allow the night to finish its careful work. Good night.